Hello there. Welcome to the First Americans, Early Indigenous Peoples in the Americas. This is our first unit that will count for points. Our first testable unit, which corresponds, oddly enough, with Chapter 1 in our main textbook. This group of people that we'll look at takes us back 15,000 years. Yes, you heard that right. 15,000 years. And the first Americans, early indigenous peoples, various other titles we'll see through the course of those 15,000 years. The Clovis peoples, Paleo-Indians, archaic peoples, all of them we could and should say, I think at the outset, as it says at the bottom of the screen, are the ancestors of peoples we now refer to as Native Americans. So this entire first unit spans about 15,000 years of time, but these are the first human beings ever to populate not only North America but South America. Those two continents were the last two parts of the world, other than Antarctica, to be inhabited by humans. So we're going to take a long look at them. I do a rather extended unit here on this that goes way beyond even our textbook. You should read Chapter 1 in the textbook, or maybe you've already done so, but more than is in the textbook will end up sort of being your responsibility on the study guide and from this PowerPoint lecture. We go back to two distant periods in human history, the Paleolithic, and I have to slow down when I say that or I turn it into mush, and the Neolithic periods in world history. And all of this, both those periods combined, are sometimes referred to as prehistory. So we need to kind of unpack the terminology here, of course, before we go forward. Paleolithic is the fancy name for what scholars have for a long time called, in a more offhand way, the Old Stone Age. Neolithic, as you might have now guessed, is the fancy name for New Stone Age. And yes, there is a Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age period too, but we need not bother with that at this point. So what is prehistory? It's an odd term, since history is the past. What could there be before the past? That's a philosophical, metaphysical mind bender. Fortunately, that's not what they mean here. They're looking at the more specific definition of the word history, which is the study of the past. And historians study primarily, as hopefully we already know from the introductory lecture, if not, you'll hear it again here and later in the class, written records of the past, written records from the past. And prehistory then studies that long period, thousands of years where we're starting, where human beings roamed the earth and lived and did most of what we do today, but did so without writing. So prehistory means before the written word, the human past before writing. And this then this term prehistory then kind of covers both Paleolithic and Neolithic. Shattered bones, chipped stones, and bits of charcoal. A phrase from an archaeologist currently who writes good books, and I like the phrase. What we're getting at here is the fact that much of the evidence that we use to put together what happened and how people lived 15, 10, 5,000 years ago, whether in the Americas or anywhere else in the world, comes from the study of archaeology. So this is the one, it says at the top, the one unit that I get to play archaeologist. I'm a trained historian. I'm trained to look at primary source documents and analyze them. But since we don't have any in prehistory, we have to rely heavily on other disciplines, and the one that's sort of at the top of the list, first and foremost, is archaeology. And so what do archaeologists study to know about the distant past? Artifacts, stuff, Historians look at written records, archaeologists look at stuff, and you see some of the stuff they look at in the pictures there. Professor Rourke tells us, our beloved textbook author, archaeologists tend to focus on physical objects such as bones, spear points, pots, baskets, jewelry, clothing, and buildings, and on and on and on. So, since we don't have written materials that were left over because there weren't any from this period, it makes sense that we're going to have to rely on stuff dug out of the ground in archaeological sites, in digs, like the ones you see in the pictures, at least two of the pictures. So this is the stuff, pardon the pun, of archaeology and of prehistory. We detour for just a moment, only a slight detour, to talk about ecology and climate in prehistory. In some ways, you could say sort of climate is everything in understanding prehistoric peoples. And I'm keeping this very simple. There's a whole course to be taught, is taught in some places on this subject. But I just want to make basically one simple point. And you see on the screen, when climate warmed and got hot and wetter, warm and wet go together, more regions became habitable with more food available. So this is something you should keep in mind because it's slightly counterintuitive, I think. Warm and wet go together, and cold and dry go together. So when the climate, not the weather, which is sort of a more short-term thing, but the climate gets hotter and wetter, more regions are able to sustain human life and human settlements. Why? Well, because plants and animals both do better in warm and wetter weather. The animals, if for no other reason than because there's more plants in that kind of climate, because plants require sunlight and water to grow. So in warmer, wetter periods, more food is available, at least in more places. Not everywhere, but in more places. And this means also that population tends to go up during warm, wet periods as well. However, there can be issues in both colder and drier periods and warm and wetter periods in the course of prehistory. That's clear. So more population means you've got more mouths to feed, and so what might be a plentiful supply of food in a certain place or region at one point might not be the same 50, 100 years later. Some peoples will have reached an ecological ceiling, then causing a decline in population or a decline in their way of life, or a potential one anyway, and a migration or splintering of groups, or sometimes just flat out conflict over resources, food and other scarce resources as the population grows. This is actually part of the way that we can explain how humans started to fan out across the globe. This kind of splintering effect, migrations due to ecological issues, population growth outdistancing the food supply. But of course, colder and drier has its problems as well, because there's less habitable land, and so one could expect, and you see it in the archaeological historical record, that there's more conflict and more difficulty because you've got people, a relative larger number of people fighting over now even fewer resources. So when the climate got colder and drier, people often had to compete, sometimes violently, over the fewer gardens of Eden remaining. That is a phrase that archaeologists often use, believe it or not. Of course, it's a biblical phrase. And what they mean by it in archaeology is kind of something like an oasis. when it's they existed still in warmer periods as well, but when colder and drier periods hit in one or another part of the world, then there are fewer of these, and making each Garden of Eden kind of oasis type area, some spot that's teeming with plants and animals, things that are edible for human beings. People then tend to cluster there, and sometimes there's conflict over those gardens of Eden. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And this is a quote from a famous, now deceased intellectual. I could use this phrase for any unit in our class, but I'm going to use it here and repeat it in a number of slides, as you'll see, monotonously. But it's so it kind of sinks in. This is a good lesson, kind of as an extension from our introductory lecture. If you visit a foreign country, already have, and hopefully you have, and will, or will, at some point, of course, you already know this without visiting, but you'll sort of experience firsthand that people have different customs in different parts of the world, different language, different food, different way of life, and we don't usually, although Americans are somewhat known for it, nonetheless, go somewhere else in the world and expect them to do things exactly the way we do. Because we already understand it's a different country. They have different customs and mores and values. So the past is something like that, and hence the quote. So when we study the past, if we want to get it right, this is a good reminder. It's a good phrase, again, to commit to memory. Just like if we go to Spain, we sort of expect that the culture there is different, and we prepare for it, or we adjust to it. Well, when we go back in time, hypothetically, in our minds, and visit, the Paleo-Indians 10,000 years ago, or our founding fathers, 400 years ago, then we, I think, must make the same adjustment. We must understand they do things differently. They did things differently. They thought differently. They had different motives. And so if we're going to get history right, we must take into account the differences between now and then, and try to put ourselves as much as possible. I'm not saying it's 100% possible, because it's a work of the imagination in some ways, but put ourselves in those people's shoes, whoever they are, whenever it is in the past. Try to understand things from their perspective forward, not just from our perspective today, looking back on them. That's when we get into problems of presentism, a topic that I covered in the introductory lecture. So keep that in mind, and that phrase especially in mind. It'll be yet another tool to help us. So I have a 4-part series under this quote, 4 slides in a row, that will give us a look at the global hunter-gatherer way of life, or forager. Forager is another word for hunter-gatherer. And hunter-gatherers, of course, were ubiquitous in going back to early humans. So you could say that, you should say, that hunter-gatherer is the default position for human survival. So at one point, all peoples in all places were hunter-gatherers. We'll see that gradually, at different times in different places around the world, some peoples start to move to agriculture when they learn it and when they need to acquire it or utilize it in some cases. So, but we're going to look at the global hunter-gatherer way of life, which is to say that at least in these few first number of slides, we're not going to be zeroing in on the first Americans or Native Americans. We're going to be talking about the global hunter-gatherer way of life. And that's actually easier to do than it may sound. Not easy, but that's because the forager's way of life was roughly the same, or at least quite similar, just about everywhere in the world. I'm not saying there were no cultural differences, no differences from one region or one continent to another. That wouldn't make sense. Of course, there were, but the way of life is remarkably similar. So, what features do we see that these groups share in common from place to place? They lived in groups of 20 to 50 only. These are small populations. This is kind of like an entire society. Once or twice a year, they gathered with a larger group, maybe 100 to 200, and it can vary, for exchange of goods, information, and potential mates. So we'll come back to that thought. Were the exchange of goods, information, and mates. They were nomadic. These people moved around. They returned to favorite and favored spots, campsites, at the right season. Doesn't mean they roamed through the woods or roamed across the plains haphazardly. They would know where they were going. They got very good at navigating their topography and their ecological niche, their ecosystem, and so they would go strategically to one spot when it favored them, and then leave and go to another one. But because the food in those days were wild-growing plants, fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts, etc., before farming, they had to chase the plants around. And because they hadn't domesticated animals yet, that really comes usually around the same time that learning agriculture does, they had to chase the animals around as well. So this is why all, or almost all, I should say, there are a few exceptions, hunter-gatherers were nomadic. They're not going to build a New York City or any kind of urban area. That wouldn't make sense because they're going to be moving around so often. They're staying in one spot for only certain lengths of time before moving on to another, more strategically favorable spot for survival and for thriving. So they're nomadic. They hunted wild animals from megafauna, which means the biggest sort of animals from continent to continent. In the Americas, it will be the mammoths, bison, other things, somewhat different creatures than other parts of the world. But all the way down to smaller animals like deer. They may have actually helped, and we'll talk more about this as we go along, to send some animals into extinction. There is a controversy among archaeologists and other scholars in related fields about this to this day. It does, I think, appear likely that peoples in various parts of the world, including the Americas, probably had at least some hand, some role in hunting the megafauna into extinction, like the mammoth. They also then, in the gatherer part of hunter-gatherer, gathered and took in wild-growing plants, seeds, roots, nuts, grass, berries, fruits, vegetables, etc., etc. But that means wild-growing. They're not sowing seeds. They haven't learned to do this or don't want to do it yet. The early way, again, entry-level way of acquiring these kind of edibles is to go out and search for them and pick them growing wild in wilderness areas. So that gives us at least a foundation to start with to understand the hunter-gatherer way of life worldwide, and then we'll reduce it down more specifically to the first Americans and their way of life. But these things certainly apply to the first Americans. So the past is a foreign country, part 2. For 99% of human existence, humans have lived or did live as hunter-gatherers alone. This is starting from about 200,000 years ago, which is taken to be the approximate date of the arrival of Homo sapiens, our species, on to the world scene. So if we start from there and come to the present, 99% of human beings' existence, we were all hunter-gatherers, wherever you were. So agriculture comes late in the game. Beads and stories, the development of culture, a set of ideas and beliefs. This is culture, a definition of sorts. A set of ideas and beliefs shared by a group of people that are passed on, including technological knowledge. And this does set humans apart from other species. They don't have culture, not in the definitional sense of the word, because, for one, they can't pass knowledge down, at least beyond maybe a couple of pieces of information from generation to generation. Human beings, especially once they learn and manipulate spoken language, and then even more so once they learn to manipulate and employ written language, then are able to pass knowledge on down in sort of much greater quantity and with much greater detail and specificity. So this does set human beings apart. Beads and stories, again, I'm quoting from the same archaeologist I quoted from a minute ago. Beads means the technological things, which is also including artwork and other such goods, items. Stories is kind of the intellectual life of hunter-gatherers. So we'll get to kind of one at a time. And stories, of course, are part of culture and get passed down from generation to generation. Stories would even include religious myths and ideas and values. So that's part of culture as well. So beads and stories is just a kind of clever and simple way to say and to remember that we're talking about sort of two elements that combine to form human culture: technology and ideas. So with the technology first, quoting one of the scholars you see at the bottom: stone, bone, hide, animal guts turned to human design. The peoples here in all parts of the world had complex, innovative toolkits. Toolkit, by the way, is also a term used by archaeologists. It sounded funny when I first started reading a great deal on this years ago, but it is pretty standard now. They weren't toolkits quite in the same way that we think of them today. It wasn't a toolbox that's rectangular shaped. Nonetheless, they did sometimes have multiple tools on site or on their person to use for various needs. The use of fire, the domestication of fire hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe even earlier, we're not entirely sure, constitutes a technological advance. For sure, we'll come back to that. Stone multi-purpose tools became the norm, at least from the evidence that we have from archaeological digs. Spearheads, arrow points, axes, knives, choppers, scrapers, etc. In fact, the terms Old Stone Age, New Stone Age actually come from the plethora of stone tools found at sites all over the world from hunter-gatherer groups. When archaeologists have dug up their remains, the remains not just their persons, that too, their skeletal remains, but also the remains of their culture. So lots of stone tools. That doesn't, by the way, mean that stone tools were the only types of tools that were used. By just looking at the archaeological record, one would initially think that was true because it's overwhelmingly that. But keep in mind, and this perhaps already occurred to you, that other types of tools made out of other things besides stone would tend not to survive thousands of years because they would be broken down by nature: wood, bone, etc. So there may have been a lot more wood and bone and other types of tools than now exists in the archaeological record because of that. Though it does, I think, appear safe to say that stone tools in most places sort of were the dominant type of tool anyway. But we know that there were, for instance, some bone tools because a few of them have survived. Bone would normally break down, but in certain areas, say a place that was under ice for thousands of years and then was brought out into the open, and an archaeological site, was, started there, and they come up with this perfectly preserved or very well preserved bone tool. Those kind of things are gold finds for archaeologists. So we do know that there were bone tools for sure for that reason, but it stands to reason that there would have been anyway, that they just don't tend to survive the ravages of nature over the long term. In some places we see rather elaborate toolkits develop, and rather complex and sophisticated technologies and artifacts coming out of that. Multi-fabric stitched clothing, animal organs, gourds used for watertight bags, animal sinew, vegetable fiber for cord and for rope, plant fibers that were used for nets and baskets. In some places they made robes from twisted vegetable fibers. The main thing I'm getting at here in this little segment is, if you look at that, and I could go on and on and on, you can see that they're really using everything they possibly can, to put to use. And why not? This is survival. Right? It wasn't as easy to survive then as it is for us today, for obvious reasons. So they had to get smart quickly, and they did. Right? They had to get crafty and innovative, and they did. They found a way to use as much of nature as they possibly could to survive and to thrive. So that section of text on the screen does, I think, indicate such. Let's go back to a couple of these. Use of fire. This one is, of course, of extreme importance. Use of fire helped to turn many things around in favor of human beings that weren't previously. So what are the uses of fire? Once it can be controlled, manipulated, human beings know how to start fires and put them out. Not just fires that happen, like forest fires that nature provides, and you got to deal with it, but fire deliberately employed for human benefit. The uses are many, including scaring off or warding off wild animals. They tend not to like fire. That was of use. For lighting and heating, that was, of course, of great use. So control of fire allowed human beings to live and thrive in colder climates that may have not been livable at all before the use of fire. So this is of great benefit. Also, fire allows human beings to cook their food, and that's not just sort of culture and taste. It's that too. Though there are plenty of types of food that aren't cooked today that we like and are perfectly edible and healthy. But it's not just about taste, though it was probably that as well. There are some unintended consequences. Right? Already back to one of our watchwords, one of our tools, different type of tool, conceptual tool from our introductory lecture. Right? We see the unintended effect of human beings controlling fire. I'll just get into one of them. This one is astonishing, and incredible. So, cooking food allowed the human body. I'm not saying the body makes these decisions in real time. This is the process of evolution over generations and generations of time. But it's as if the body is doing it. So I'm just going to talk about it that way. So the use of fire to cook food makes it easier to digest the food that you cook. And so before fire, it stands to reason that human beings would have a tougher time digesting their food because nothing was cooked. They didn't control fire yet. And that meant that the stomach, the intestines, had to be sort of much bigger to sort of break down all that food because fire didn't do any of the work for us. But once human beings start to regularly cook their food, then the body makes a decision, again, sort of, that, hey, we don't need big guts any longer, and the savings from that can be employed to put to better use somewhere else in the body. And where is it of more use? The brain, of course. So really, it's the use of fire that reduces the size of the gut, that allows that savings in energy to be put towards a larger brain. And human beings' big brains, which make us smart creatures, require lots of energy. That we take in. I think the brain is like, I don't know, my numbers aren't exactly right here, but around 6% or something of the human body in terms of mass, and the brain takes up nonetheless about 20-25% of the energy. So the large brain is not possible, does not happen without use of fire, leading to reduction of stomach size, which leads to increase of brain size. There's another unintended consequence of this as well that's also amazing, and that is that to do all of this, what had to be done was to for women to be able to give birth earlier, because larger brains, and I don't want to get into the details of this, I've witnessed it firsthand as a father, but right, children, even babies with large skulls, at least relative to the rest of their body, at birth, it's a painful process, as women well know, at least women that have had children. And so, in essence, what nature did, what the body did, was sort of make a trade-off and say, okay, we'll allow you humans to have bigger brains and be smarter, but in order to do that, you're going to have those kids earlier, because there's going to be at some point where the skull and cranial capacity will be too large to get through the birth canal at all. So you're going to have your babies early. In a sense, all babies today, and all of us, when we were babies, infants, were born prematurely, because that's what nature did. Like, okay, the big brain isn't going to work if we allow the body to stay as a fetus for too long, because the brain is too big, the skull is too big by that point. So this you can see in nature if you look at. If you get to see it live, or if you've seen, at the very least, video on TV footage of this, but let's say horses or other types of mammals, they're like born, and it's like not very long before they're like up and walking, maybe kind of with spindly legs, and they're at first rather uneasy and unsteady, but they're walking. Right? So other mammals aren't born early. They're basically come out of the womb ready to go. Humans, not the case. All right, we know that, I think, well, not at all. We have to take care of infants and babies and toddlers for a long time before they're able to function, at least, completely independently. So this is all part of the unintended consequences of the domestication and use of fire. I'm not saying fire is the only element in explaining all those developments, but I think it's certainly true that without it, none of that stuff could have happened. So we wouldn't be here, at least not in this form, and certainly not communicating by computer, right now. So that's a big development historically. What about multi-fabric stitched clothing? Who cares? The history of needle and thread? Yes, it's actually of much more importance than it may sound. This, what seems rather mundane, easy invention, needle and thread, was in some ways a turning point in human existence. Now, it must have been invented and learned slightly differently in one place at a different time than another. Nonetheless, we see it popping up in many parts of the world, particularly in colder climates. and you can see why, especially multi-fabric stitch clothing. But let's just take the invention itself, needle and thread. Sounds like I could invent that in 5 seconds. Okay, but this is something we're going to see. It's going to be an issue again. So let's deal with it now. It's very easy to look back on inventions, say, in history, technology in history, ideas in history, and say, well, that's not such a big deal. We all know how to do that. Or we all know that now. That's, in a sense, a form of presentism, because we're assuming, in a sense, we're kind of judging. How could those people have been so dumb that they didn't know how to use needle, make and then use needle and thread? Right? How dense could they be? Well, keep in mind that it's much easier, or things seem much easier on this side of them after we have them than on the other side before they were invented. Somebody comes along and does it first in one society or another. So again, this issue will come up again. If you find yourself thinking in this class, or even in your daily life, and we all do at some point, you see something on TV, some guy made millions of dollars over with some little invention, and you think, why didn't I think of that? Right? All of us have said that before. Why didn't I think of that? But we usually mean it in the sense that that's so simple. Why wasn't it me thought of that? I don't think that's actually the proper way to think of it. Actually, what you should be thinking, what you're really saying when you ask, why didn't I think of that, is how is she so smart in figuring out how to do that? Good question. Why was she so smart? How was she so smart? And I wasn't. So when we find ourselves saying, why didn't I think of that, we're actually giving the compliment to the person or people that did, and they deserve it. Needle and thread are a much bigger invention than it sounds, because it was difficult to do more than we think, but secondly, because of its revolutionary impact. Clothing is another factor, along with fire, in humans being able to inhabit more areas of the globe in colder climes, as well as warm and hot. So multi-fabric stitch clothing, some of the stuff that we have is amazing. Sometimes in colder areas, we see coats and outfits that have 6 different types of fur stitched together into kind of one coat. And that's not just because they had a beaver pelt and say, okay, that's not big enough to go around the whole body, so let's sew a deer skin onto that as well. Okay, that's still not big enough. This was strategically done to use certain fabrics for certain areas of the body, sometimes for maximal warmth in one part of the body, sometimes, say, for maximal maneuverability, but able to stay warm as well. And so it's kind of like they were, and you'll laugh, you should, I guess, but it's kind of like it was an early prehistoric version of REI. They were already making rather complex clothing once needle and thread was available, had it been invented. So, fire is of tremendous importance technologically and in human evolution, cultural evolution, and multi-fabric, or just any kind of stitched clothing with needle and thread, also a technological revolution. Let's now move to the cognitive revolution. And what's sometimes referred to, at least by one very influential professor, collective learning. We all actually learn through a process of collectivity and cooperation. We like to believe that we learn individually. And in some ways we do. I'm not denying there isn't some of that. And when you learn, whether in college or on your own, whatever you're learning, whether from books or from other things happening in life, yes, you deserve credit for things that you work at to learn. So in this class, if you work hard and earn a good grade in this class, then you deserve individual credit for it. I'm not denying that at all. However, none of what you would learn in this class, or will learn in this class, is could be possible just with you alone. You didn't write the textbook. You didn't teach the class. You didn't manufacture the textbook. You didn't manufacture and make the computer you're looking at right now, at least as far as I know. And so if we keep sort of looking at all the people that had to do even one iota of the work involved to get all of the information in this class knowledge into your head to pass the class or better, we're into the thousands of people. So human beings do learn collectively. If you have to look something up in this class, that's fine, and Google it, and go to Wikipedia, which is a quick offhand reference only, but it can be sometimes useful, taken with a grain of salt. Then you're right. You're having to rely on someone else that put that technology together, and not just one person usually. So this is what collective learning means. Societies learn together. They're all kind of networked together. Now we're more networked together by far than ever before because of computers and the internet and social media. But there have been networks of learning going all the way back to prehistoric times. So the cognitive revolution usually is seen to have started about 70 or so thousand years ago, maybe 80,000 years ago, and we're not entirely sure how it happened. This is one of the mysteries of prehistory. One of the most interesting features of studying prehistory is that there are so many intriguing question marks and mysteries to this day, puzzles that aren't solved yet. I talked also in the introductory lecture about how studying history is like being a private or detective, being a detective, a district attorney or something, any kind of investigator, because you're investigating something in the past and trying to come up with answers. And sometimes these kind of issues here, like what caused the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, are kind of like unsolved mysteries. We love to watch those TV shows about real life crime, unsolved mysteries. Well, here's one right here. What caused the cognitive revolution? It's not entirely clear. There are different theories, one of which, and I don't need to go into this, but one of which is that it was a fluke. That there was a genetic mutation in the human brain that ended up boosting cognitive sort of thinking ability just by chance, which it's theoretically possible that that's the case. Maybe especially since we haven't been able to come up with any alternative that seems to better explain it. There are some other alternatives out there, but it's not clear which, if any of them, are correct. So human beings are the only species that can do large-scale flexible cooperation. Large-scale flexible cooperation. So other species can cooperate on a small scale, but not flexibly. Some species can do it, can cooperate with a certain amount of flexibility, but not on a large scale. So flexible and large scale can both be done by other animal species, but there aren't any others that can do both large scale and flexible at the same time. So we're unique in that sense, and it explains a great deal. So what do we mean by flexibility here? This means kind of cultural flexibility, social flexibility. We can change our social systems and social institutions, and sometimes do. Right? Countries have moved from capitalism to socialism. They've moved from authoritarianism to democracy, and altered their social systems and done it successfully. But take bees. Bees certainly cooperate on a large scale, a huge scale. Ants and other such creatures as well, but they don't do so flexibly. right? Ants don't, say, well, you know what? We're tired of this damn ant communism thing here. We're going to become a capitalist, sort of ant hill. That's laughable. In fact, there was a movie made about this very idea, a comedic movie, but it sort of made some points nonetheless. The movie called Ants, where I believe it was Woody Allen that did the voiceover in the cartoon. It's a cartoon movie. Did the voiceover of the main character, and maybe you've seen it. If you haven't, the Woody Allen ant was the only ant in the colony that was like the rebel. Like, I don't want to do it this way. I don't want to cooperate with you guys, which is funny because, of course, ants are like totally programmed. Each ant has its role and it can't do anything else. It's programmed, genetically programmed to do only one thing, and it's sacrificing everything for the greater good of the whole ant or bee colony. So those types of species cooperate for sure on a large scale, but not at all flexibly. Now, some of the primates, chimpanzees, for instance, can be somewhat flexible. I'm not saying they can establish, capitalist systems and democracies, but they can be a little bit more flexible, but not on a large scale. Chimpanzees, in order to cooperate with other chimpanzees, have to know them. They have to be able to recognize them, face to face, eye to eye, and know, okay, I've met this, chimp before, and I know something about their character. He or she is trustworthy. So, and they can't do that sort of, I think, beyond like 100 or 200 individuals. I'm not sure human beings can do that either. Trust people sort of beyond that. We have to find alternative kind of replacement methods to go beyond 100 to 200. I mean, think about it. Are there 100 people in your life that you trust, right? With sort of the most important things about you and your most important needs and desires? 100? I don't know if I can get off of one hand. 1, 2, 3. That you can really trust. So chimps have to cooperate, have to be able to know you, know the other chimps. Human beings are the only creatures that can cooperate, sort of do large-scale collective organizing, and do it, flexibly. And part of the reason here is because human beings can have found and have the ability to find other ways to draw people together than just trust. In America, 330 some odd million people, there's no way we can all trust each other by knowing each other. I can trust all other 330 million because I've met them all, and I've talked to them all, and that's impossible. So we find kind of shortcuts to do that that actually work remarkably well. So we do this partly through telling stories, using stories to glue whole populations together. Now remember, hunter-gatherers, at least going far enough back, only lived together in groups of 20 to 50, which required a lot of cooperation anyway. But that's not large-scale cooperation, at least by global standards in the present, because we now can cooperate, roughly speaking, in the millions, as our society and many other countries in the world have proven. So how do stories hold us together? And I'm not saying this is the only explanation for how you get millions of people cooperating at least enough to, for life to be reasonably secure and without chaos and anarchy breaking out. What type of stories? Well, there are various kinds, but maybe the most powerful in history and prehistory are religious stories. And so I'll just give you that one as an example. But there are economic, political stories, other types of kind of myths. But anything that is sort of used as an idea, set of ideas, stories that people share in common. So if you share religious belief in common, then that is sort of a social glue that sort of brings and sticks people together. Now, in our modern world, we've proven that it can be multiple stories that overlap and we can still hold societies together. Nonetheless, the glue is still there. So we're a multi-religious society today. Not everyone believes the stories of the same religion, and yet for those that do believe in one chunk here and another religious belief, a chunk there, right? Those stories still hold them together, and there are sometimes then overarching stories. In our case today, again, I didn't want to get into this, but it's complicated to explain. We have, for instance, our own political and legal history, our Constitution, for instance, and the values of liberty and equality that go along with that. Those are stories in a sense, right? They're ideas, stories. There's a story behind the Constitution, behind the Declaration of Independence, which we're going to get into in this very class. But these are forms of social glue through stories as well. And all of this stems from the ability to use and manipulate language, not law language, but language, and of the leap forward in cognitive ability that came with the cognitive revolution. The past is a foreign country. 3. Hunter-gatherers took in and retained an enormous amount of knowledge and had and used sophisticated patterns of thought about the world because they had to. It's, I think, a very common misconception, and I'll say it simply, to think that hunter-gatherers were dumb compared to us. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we'll see this certainly about Native Americans or the first Americans as well, since they're hunter-gatherers too. But these people had to be smart, and they had to hold in their head an enormous amount of knowledge. In fact, probably more than we do today, because they didn't have writing, they didn't have books, they didn't have computers to store the knowledge for them. It all had to sort of stay up in their heads. It could be communicated and passed to other people in the community or passed down through the generations, but it had to be done orally or by demonstration because there wasn't a way of recording it. There are a couple of exceptions to this over time, but for the most part, the point stands. So the tool making of hunter-gatherers, of prehistoric peoples, does show clear signs of human ability to think, brain power increasing over thousands and thousands, actually millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. That's happening, but also, again, passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. Culture that also explains how, say, stone tools, if you analyze the archaeological record and can date, when stone tools were created, and the dating techniques, carbon and other types of techniques are actually quite accurate in many ways today for dating either artifacts or human animal remains, and human remains. They're quite sophisticated, much more accurate than you may think. But what the record shows, not surprisingly, but nonetheless important to point out, that the tools tend to get better over time, partly because the human brain is getting better through evolution, and because culture is passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. And when you can do that, the next generation doesn't have to sort of go back and reinvent the wheel again. They don't have to start from scratch, right? And a lot of this is passed down through families. From father to son, and so forth, so that the son, is taught by his father, everything that the father learned in a whole lifetime, and he's taught, in his childhood, or up to, say, becoming an adult, and now he doesn't have to spend his whole lifetime doing all that. He's already internalized everything his father learned, say in 50 or 60 years of life. He's done that in 18 years, and now he can spend the rest of his life, career, so to speak, innovating and going beyond and making better tools or whatever it is that he's doing. So thinking ahead with a sequence, a plan of action. Tool making wasn't just, I'm sure it was sometimes, but at its best, there were steps, and generally the more sophisticated, innovative tools required a more complicated and just more in quantity steps to complete. Hunter-gatherers had to have vast amounts of information about their natural environment, had to learn about it, and again, another way to see how smart these people were. You have to realize, to survive, they had to be. They don't have a choice. We either get smart, we either bring in and retain a great deal of knowledge, or we're gonna die. We're going to go under for one reason or another. One of the places you can see this is in their strategies for foraging, their strategies for gathering wild plants, what have been called by archaeologists as optimal foraging models, which are basically algorithms for determining a food's return value, return rate. So when you first learn about hunter-gatherers, and I admit this is true of me as well, when I first started learning about this stuff a long time ago, I just thought of hunter-gatherers as kind of wandering around and accidentally running into a bush full of berries or whatever. And okay, let's grab some of these and put them in our baskets and go back home. Well, okay, I'm sure that happened, but it's way more complicated than that. And what optimal foraging models means is that scholars have kind of put together from what they can glean from these societies in the past, that they had a number of different strategies. It's kind of like they had like an army that has, or a football team that has sort of different plays and different systems that can be interchanged and one exchanged for another. So it was quite complicated. And just to give you a kind of a thumbnail sort of sketch example of this, the algorithms would actually eventually kind of be baked into a person from the time they start learning this stuff. So by the time they're an adult, it's already kind of second nature to them. So let's say a gatherer group of, I don't know, like 10 people is out away from the campsite early in the morning, and they're looking for food, and they just sort of got there. They've been there the previous spring because they come to that part of the their region every spring, but this is their first day this spring, and so from one spring to another, where the food is can change somewhat depending on lots of factors. So they go out and about a number of miles out, they've been out for about an hour or so, they do find some berries, just to pick something, pardon the pun. So at that point, the leader of the group just sort of shakes his head and motions for them to just keep walking. And maybe one young guy's like, wait a minute, or young woman. It was often women that did the gathering, so this could be all women. But maybe one of them says, wait a minute, why aren't we stopping? There's food right here. But the leader already knows, maybe they already know, that it's that doesn't fit the algorithm. So what does that mean? Well, if we keep going out, right, we have to come back this way anyway before the day is done to get back to the campsite, to find the rest of our families there, hopefully alive and well. So we can always sort of fall back on these berries on the way back. But if we fill our baskets with them now, then our baskets aren't right, so they can't take anything else that might be better. We could go back to the village, dump the stuff off, and come back again and go beyond the bushes onto something else. But that takes up a lot of time. So in a sense, what's being said here is, through time-tested experience over many generations, they already have this sort of down to an algorithm. And that it's not worth stopping to pick these berries, at least this early in the day. Maybe in part also another complicating factor, knowledge that they had stored in their memory banks, taught to them by the previous generation, by their parents, by the village elders, that these berries they require a lot of processing work, so that goes into the algorithm, whether or not it's worth it to pick these. There's a lot of work involved in these. We have other things that are less work. The food value or caloric value is actually low in these berries. Hypothetically here, how would they know about calories? Well, of course they didn't in the scientific sense, but they did in a more just straightforward human sense, and that is you can often tell after eating food whether it gives you a lot of energy or not much at all. So they would know these berries don't actually give us that much. There's not a lot of bang for the buck in these berries. So we're better off, and our own experience and our own ancestors' experience has shown and now taught us that the algorithm tells us to skip these. We're looking at numbers, odds, percentages. It's an algorithm. It's more complicated than you might think. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's not complex. So the leader, again, already knows. That's why he just sort of waves everybody on. Nope, we're not stopping here. Keep going. Because he already knows this isn't the high percentage way to get the most out of their food gathering a day or part of the day. Right? You never ever thought before, and again, I didn't either before I first started this, you never ever thought that hunting and gathering, that gathering wild berries could be this complicated. But upon second thought now, you realize that when survival at stakes, people will get pretty, right, they'll get pretty detailed. They'll do what it takes to survive and thrive. What about the value of gossip? That can't be right. Is that a misprint? Well, we know that foragers needed a lot of information about who was, trustworthy, right? So we talked about chimps being having to trust. Well, in small groups, trust among humans is important as well. And so gossip had believe it or not, a value to it. Now, that's even true today to some degree. And the reason I have to say that is because we usually think of gossip as something trivial, something petty when you're talking behind somebody's back, which is, of course, part of what it means. But gossip can, even today, be valuable because sometimes talking about people, about whether they're trustworthy or not, is important. So let's say you have work somewhere, and at your job, there's somebody that cuts corners, an employee that kisses up to the boss, but then doesn't do their share of the work and tries to sort of pass it off like they do, and you end up having to do a lot for them, et cetera, et cetera. At some point, you might be alone with someone else that works there that you trust more, and say, hey, have you noticed that Bob, whenever the boss is around, he sort of kisses up to them, but then as soon as he leaves, he doesn't do any work, and he tries to make it look like he does all the work and we do it. Yeah, I have noticed that, right? And the two of you get together and say, you know what, that's not fair. We should do something about this. Maybe you don't want to rat Bob out, but maybe you want to do something to try to make an unjust situation just. So that's a modern day example of how gossip can actually be valuable. It can also be petty and I think wrong as well. But it can go both ways. So, but when survival was on the line in prehistoric times, all the way back to the Paleolithic, then who was trustworthy, knowing who was brave, who was smart, right? Who sort of did the most on hunts or sort of gathering forays. It's important to share that information, sometimes even behind the back of the person in question, if they're dangerous, if they're causing a problem. They might have to be confronted about it eventually, but so sometimes gossip was necessary for survival. You needed to sort of weed out, or at least decide who were the people that could be trusted, that were there when the group needed it, and those that were not, could not. Symbolic thought and the development of art and adornment. Human beings' ability to reason and think stands out, of course. The only creatures that can do so, at least at sort of fantastically advanced levels. And one type of thinking that we can do that animals can't is symbolic thought, also abstract thought. So abstract thought means that, as far as we can tell, animals don't do this, but they can't think. They can't think about or certainly communicate things that aren't there. Right? We have a fabulous ability to think about things that aren't even real. Many of you, and me as well, like fantasy or science fiction books or movies, right? Games, right? Characters that aren't real, types of beings and creatures that don't even exist, and yet we can think about them in our minds. Animals don't have the seeming ability to really do that. And animals do have the ability, some of them, to communicate kind of basic things. So some types of animals in the wild can make a sound, and all the others in the species, in the community, know that that says, lion. And, oh, we got to watch out. And another sound is made that might mean there's another danger nearby. But what they can't do is sort of abstract from that, and they certainly can't have a complex story about it. Back to stories again. So they can't, come back into the group and say, hey, and human beings, of course, can do this. Hey, you guys know down that sort of rocky area down by the river, and there's like a little kind of cave in there as you go by the path. Yeah. Well, be careful. A lion just sort of I saw go in there as I walked by. Thank God he didn't see me. But apparently, right, there's a den in there, and there might be other lions there. And they didn't know that before. And now this guy has just explained that. If he just came running into the camp, and I was there and just screamed lion, right? I'd want a bit more information than that. With an alarming sound in his voice saying lion can be somewhat useful. But I'd want more than that. What do you mean? When? Where? How? What? So human beings can think abstractly. Symbolically is related to this. It's an abstraction of another type, but I'm focusing here on how symbolic thought gets put into art and adornment. Paintings and caves, the prehistoric period, or prehistoric periods, on rocks, paintings on various objects, carved objects, shells and beads used as jewelry, painted designs on objects, tattooing in various cultures. And sometimes these things done for apparently religious reasons, sometimes for reasons having to do with myths and beliefs, religious beliefs, but also it appears likely that sometimes it was just for enjoyment, sort of beauty for beauty's own sake, aesthetic value. This does seem to be something baked into the human genetic structure. It's part of our nature to want to create beautiful things, art objects. It's likely, from one of the great scholars on this subject, it's likely that art first appeared in human history when our ancestors tried to reconcile the reality of life with their vision of what life should be like. So, right, then symbolic thinking is a form of abstract thinking as well, because they can think about not just the reality of what's right there, but they can think about what they want life to be like, what it should be like in their view, which it isn't. So they are abstracting, and sometimes this, as the quote is claiming, was a motive or a reason to produce art in the first place. The Past is a Foreign Country, Part 4. And thank God we're at the end, right? So hunter-gatherers had a value system, and we'll see more of this in greater detail when we get to Native Americans and different groups of Native Americans, specific groups. But in a general sense, and this is at the global level as well, the value system was one of cooperation and sharing. There's some competition in there as well, but overall cooperation and sharing, cooperative learning we talked about, which still goes on today. Reciprocity, which means kind of a mutual give and take. You do this, and I'm required to do that in return. Why? Well, part of it's the environment, and keep in mind reciprocity and altruism go together, or the phrase reciprocal altruism, which is a phrase used in a number of subjects or disciplines today. Reciprocal altruism itself means right, to sort of doing good for to other people, for other people. So reciprocal means give and take. So give and take, that's helpful. This kind of like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. So it's not necessarily based on love and kindness for its own sake, though I think that's sometimes comes about along with this and is there as well. But the reciprocal altruism is saying that it doesn't have to be that, and it's not just that. Sometimes it might not be that at all. The reason that you don't hit me over the head with a hammer, well, you don't know where I live, thankfully, is because you're afraid if you do, I'll hit you over the head with a hammer. So we learn to reciprocate and be nice to each other, even if we don't want to be, even when we don't want to be, because it makes more sense. So reciprocal altruism is, in a sense, a form of cooperation. Well, it is a form of cooperation, but a form of cooperation not necessarily based on love. It's based on practicality. Sometimes this is referred to as a non-zero-sum game or non-zero-sum outcomes. Right, where both parties benefit from some type of exchange, some type of cooperation, and they're not necessarily doing it out of a spirit of, hey, we're all in this together, right? It's all, all humankind has to work together. That can be there, or at least concern for the tribe, the group, in an emotional, loving way. But it can and often is more practical than that as well. We'll talk about competitive feast giving when we get to some specific examples of it. All human societies that have been studied far back into the past and up into the present are concerned about free riders. And that is kind of like the Bob we already talked about, that the guys gossip about, saying, "Hey, Bob isn't pulling his weight. He tries to make it look like he's doing things, and then he slacks off." But I've noticed it, and you've noticed it, but the rest of the group kind of hasn't. Human societies tend to find ways to punish such evil. They don't kill them all the time. Hunter-gatherer groups might find a way just to ostracize or shame a person that's not sort of pulling their weight, to sort of get them in line. So I'm not saying they, imprison them or kill them. Some societies eventually do, but it is a concern in every society.